Welcome to this Book at Lunchtime event on imitating authors, written by Professor Colin Burrow. My name is Wes Williams, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Champion here at Torch, which is why I'm introducing this. I'm also replicating myself as one of the speakers, and I'll explain later that there's a further replication involved in that process too. But mainly I'm delighted to welcome Colin here today to speak about his book on behalf of Torch, or I extend the welcome on behalf of Torch, and look forward to chairing this discussion as well as having my 5 minutes at the end. With me on the panel today are Professor Katherine Murphy, Katie Murphy, and Professor Stephen Halliwell. It's a great pleasure then to be able to introduce this Book at Lunchtime, which I think is the 7th of the academic year so far. Book at Lunchtime is Torch's flagship event series, taking the form of a fortnightly bite-sized book discussion with a range of commentators. One of the commentators is themselves the author, and that's in a sense part of the point of this, to not so much grill, but give the author a chance to listen to critiques and readings of, and then respond in turn. Please do take a look at our website and newsletter for the full programme for the rest of this term and next. In this book, Colin Burrow presents a fascinating account of how authors from the earliest stages of Western literature to the present day have imitated each other. The book covers, as I imagine we'll go on to talk about in a bit of detail, an impressive range of such authors, including Plato, Virgil, Lucretius, Petrarch, Cervantes, Ben Jonson, Milton, Pope, Wordsworth, Mary Shelley, and, towards the end, Kazuo Ishiguro. Burrow offers, and indeed various robots as well, towards the end. Burrow offers a clear explanation of difficult concepts and complex histories, and explains and brings into discussion a number of both ancient and modern writings, which have enabled texts to have an influence on later texts, and brings the discussion up to date by studying contemporary fictions about clones and imitation human beings, and indeed the future of imitation. Colin will read a section from the book in a minute, but first a few words of introduction to the panel members and indeed to myself. Colin himself is Professor of English and Comparative Literature in the Faculty of English and a Senior Research Fellow of All Souls College here in Oxford. His research interests focus on Renaissance literature, early Tudor writing, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and classical literatures, and broadly speaking their influence and reception, as well as editing. He also reviews contemporary poetry, novels, and a wide range of other books, most often for the London Review of Books. He's presently, it says here, working on a history of Elizabethan literature for the Oxford English Literary History. Katherine Murphy is Associate Professor also in the Faculty of English. She's also largely an early modernist and is a literary critic and scholar with interest in several areas, including literature and philosophy in the 17th century in particular. The genre of the essay, from Montaigne to the present, is another of her interests. Letters and alphabets, the production of images in relation to ways of representing knowledge, and the relationships between poetic form, rhetorical figure, and theological and philosophical ideas. If you've even dipped into this book, you'll know that Katie is an ideal reader for it. She herself is currently writing a book called The Tottering Universal, Metaphysical Prose in the 17th Century, which addresses many of the points I've just raised. Stephen Halliwell, who will speak directly after Colin, is Professor of Greek and the Wardlaw Professor of Classics at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. His published research ranges widely, both across Greek literature, from Homer to late antiquity, and Greek philosophy, from Plato to Neoplatonism. It also deals with the interface between literature and philosophy, more broadly. Professor Halliwell's main project now is on a new edition with introduction, text and commentary of Longinus's On the Sublime. I myself, who will speak last, am Professor of French in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. My main research interests are also in the field of Renaissance and early modern studies. My first book was about pilgrimage writing, and I still work on various kinds of travel. And so the metaphor of the path, which runs through this book, and that of error also is very interesting to me. I also wrote a book about monsters and their meanings, from roughly Rabelais to Racine. And now I'm writing a book about the long history of the idea of voluntary servitude, or willing subjection. As Nicholas Parsons, much lamented, used to say, our panel. Thank you. We'll start then with a reading from Colin of a passage from the book. You're allowed to say something as well as read if you like.
Am I?
Yes.
It's very kind. What shall I say? Thank you very much for having me and for introducing me so elegantly. It's a book about the imitation of authors rather than about the imitation of reality. And copies of it are available outside if you want to pay for your lunch. So do feel free to buy them. It's a wonderful book, I say it myself, which covers an awful lot of ground. But the key argument of it really is that imitation of one author by another should not be thought of as verbal theft or appropriation. Rather, it should be thought of as a process of learning from the past, of seeing practices in earlier texts which you can then put into practice yourself in new ways. And I established this view of imitation over about 400 pages, talking about all kinds of authors. And then I say on page 404, the bit that I'm about to read. So you have to imagine yourselves having been already bludgeoned into submission by a huge amount of data before I start waving my hands around in the way I do here. So the notion that imitation chiefly inheres in learning practices from prior examples could be formulated in the form of 4 propositions, which are quite easy to state but very hard to believe equally and at the same time. The propositions are these. 1. Human beings resemble and learn from other human beings. 2. Human beings become distinctive by learning from other human beings. 3. What human beings learn from each other may be an ability to perform an act which does not resemble any act performed by the exemplum. 4. Imitating earlier authors can, in all these respects, resemble imitating other human beings. And those propositions sound very simple, but they suggest that most of what we think we know about imitation, we do not in fact know. Authors acquire neither preformed identities nor sections of text from what they read and imitate. Rather, they acquire a complex blend of words, habits, forms, figures of speech, and ways of proceeding. This doesn't make the act of imitating simple or simply a cold matter of acquiring a set of techniques, because learning from another author, like learning from another person, is partly an evaluative activity. It might entail making judgments about the work of earlier authors and about which aspects of them are good and which are bad. And as what I term the late 18th century affective turn in the history of imitation illustrates, that can generate complexes of emotion in relation to prior examples, of admiration turning into a desire to be like someone, or of a growing aversion to a person or a text one has considered masterly and in whom one comes to see weaknesses. Who has not experienced that? It can even mean that the imitator engages in a dialectical revulsion from the object of imitation and creates a vengeful replicant of the imitand, which might, either in actuality or desire, destroy or overturn or transform the thing imitated, as happens in Frankenstein. The imitator can share the powerful hostility of the destructive parodist or the disillusioned pupil, or alternatively experience the abjection of a lover who fails to see the evident faults in the loved object. The imitator can also become a narcissist whose self-identification with the object of imitation enables love for the exemplum to be carried over into the imitator's own creations, like a new Pygmalion. The desire to imitate might derive from a sense of endangered awe at a cultural authority that threatens the imitator or even the autonomy of the imitator's nation, and might prompt her to produce a rebellious double of that authority, which might destroy it. Imitation can also lead to the complex of affects, of aspiration, and envy and desire that come from being drawn to someone who is capable of something of which one wants oneself to be capable. An imitator may be amazed by the skill manifested in an earlier work and then painstakingly analyse and seek to replicate the skill that made that object of amazement. And this might lead either to a recognition that the imitating author can do it a newer and a better way, or a recognition that he cannot. Imitation is a practice surrounded with both opportunities and hazards. But the wider consequence of recognising that imitation is principally a matter of acquiring a set of habituated ways of doing, a practice, and that this is something all language users necessarily do whether they want it or not, is to accept that we are partly other people, and we are also partly what we have read. Accepting that doesn't entail any loss of autonomy or the unfreedom which has been a repeated source of anxiety throughout the wider history of thinking about imitation. Human beings are skillful and self-conscious learners who continually adapt the practices they've learned from others to new uses. The imitating author, indeed, may radically misunderstand the object of imitation and remake a version of it on the basis of that mistake, or a new cultural context may make old words seem to mean something new. And so even a devoted literal imitator may, like Don Quixote, find that an attempt at exact replication produces an entirely new kind of text. Recognising that the pressures which are built up in later modernity, not to be a clone, not to be a copy, but to be an original, are products of a larger history, should remind us that those pressures can be resisted, because between the sharp opposition of originality and replication, on the other hand, is a huge zone occupied by the acquisition of practices, of learning skills, and the wider, wilder, and more emotionally turbulent uplands of influence. And there is a very strange definition of imitation in the Ad Herennium, which appears at first to be nomically evasive, but actually I think does convey a large truth in little. The Ad Herennium says, imitation is that by which we are impelled in accordance with a careful method to flourish in speaking by being like others. And that statement implies that imitation is an urge which results in a fusion of emotion and practice, a desire to be like, in which emotion and practice are constantly feeding each other. And following that urge offers the prospect of flourishing. New thoughts, new worlds, new texts could be produced by the labour of understanding and mastering the practices of earlier examples, because the practices manifested in those ancient examples aren't rules or finite injunctions, but ways of doing things, which could be extrapolated into ways of doing new things. Imitation produces transformation rather than replication, and it always leaves open the question, what will happen next? A question which, of course, is a bit terrifying when the next person to speak is a proper classicist and I've talked about Plato. But there we go. Thank you very much. Stephen.
Thank you. Colin Burrow's book is a tour de force of historical scholarship and critical thought, though I didn't myself feel at all bludgeoned by it, I'm pleased to say. It employs immense erudition in reframing what was traditionally called, in the Old Latin term, imitatio auctorum, which is here converted to the syntactically ambiguous phrase, imitating authors. I found especially rewarding the rich analysis of metaphors running through the book, the rich analysis running through the book of the competing metaphors by which perceptions as well as practices of literary imitation have been mediated and inflected. Colin Burrow's exploration of the landscape of imitatio, combining as it does large vistas with exquisitely fine inspection of individual features, conveys a sense of a territory with no hard borders. How then, one wonders, could T.S. Eliot have tried to define a boundary even between imitation and influence, claiming that while influence can fecundate, and that's one of a key family of metaphors studied in this book, imitation, I'm quoting, especially unconscious imitation, an interesting parenthesis, can only sterilize. No doubt, if pressed, Eliot would have defined his terms in such a way as to create a self-reinforcing circle of evaluation, since that is the prerogative of critics. Colin Burrow's enterprise avoids such limiting categorizations, but where does it leave imitatio in relation to the idea of intertextuality, understood as a web of only partially traceable connections? This book actually holds the notion of intertextuality at arm's length, but Colin Burrow nonetheless calls imitatio a moving target and states at one point that when practiced with habituated facility, it may not even appear to be imitation at all. it's tempting to add the opposite paradox, which was observed with delicate irony by Giacomo Leopardi in his extraordinary notebooks, that an author like Petrarch has been imitated so much that when you read him, he seems himself, this is Leopardi's judgment, to be an imitator, perhaps one might say a self-imitator. Actually, Colin Burrow in his book argues that Petrarch was indeed an imitator, but he's thinking along different lines from Leopardi. For classicists like myself, the whole domain of imitatio, including areas beyond literature, is so important that it has been partly constitutive not only of the discipline's subject matter, but to some extent the discipline's self-image, that is changing these days. Well, classicists certainly have much to ponder in this book and much to learn from it. Its pursuit of the reception history of ancient texts and ideas is consistently stimulating and indeed eye-opening. Quintilian, to cite just one salient example, turns out to be almost as significant as anyone else for the whole trajectory of the argument. And I found it almost symbolic that he was the very last person mentioned in the text of the book. I myself found Colin Burrow's book particularly valuable in helping me to discern, though Colin may not entirely agree with this, certain asymmetries in the roots of imitatio within ancient critical theory. From my perspective, there's a striking disparity, especially on the Greek side, between the place of imitatio, or in Greek mimesis, in the poetic and the rhetorical strands of ancient criticism. Poetic criticism, by which I mean criticism of poetry, is far more fixated on the axis between the work and the world than on that between text and text, or author and author. Whereas its rhetorical theory, for reasons embedded in educational practice, as Colin Burrow well knows, that makes imitatio as a relationship between texts or authors a central concern and sometimes an obsession. And even rhetorical theory started, as I see it, from the principle of internalizing schematized types or patterns of form and style before it came to treat individual authors as paradigms for imitation. In early Greek rhetorical theory, model speeches written by teachers and related practices are foundational. Plato's Phaedrus, which perhaps surprisingly Colin Burrow doesn't mention in this book, throws an interesting sidelight on this intellectual culture. Imitation of authors, as I see it, is only superimposed on this foundation at a later date and as a result of two Hellenistic developments. The first of them, the emergence of a nostalgically post-classical sensibility, which sets up a corresponding program of classicizing recuperation, and the second, the Alexandrian invention of canonicity. The assimilation of Greek culture by Rome adds, of course, further layers of complexity to this whole process, as Colin Burrow does not need to be told. Yet it continues to be the case, at any rate till late antiquity, that poetic criticism rarely gives inter-authorial imitation the degree of prominence that rhetorical criticism does. And one might want to ponder why that was so. Well, of partial exceptions to the sweeping claim I've advanced, one of the most intriguing is the treatise on the Sublime, whose own author is probably anonymous, but we call him Longinus. Colin Burrow has some very interesting things to say about this work, not least about its revivification of the Platonic metaphor of pregnancy of mind or soul. That's in chapter 13 of the treatise, where creative imitation is heavily troped as inspiration, breathing in the spirit of one's ancestors, one's great predecessors. But I'd like very quickly to say something about what follows in chapter 14, after Longinus has emphatically equated imitation with agonistic rivalry, as epitomized for him by the relationship of Plato to Homer, Plato's competition with Homer. Chapter 14 posits a three-stage thought process which is unique in ancient criticism for the channeling of imitatio as a creative impulse. Ambitious writers of the present are told they must ask themselves a trio of questions. Firstly, how would Homer or Plato have said what I am trying to say? And the great authors of the past here are imagined as looming up, I think, before the mind in a quasi-ghostly fashion which very much chimes with a leitmotif of Colin Burrow's book. Secondly, they must ask, what would they make of my work if they were present here as my judges, so that the predecessors now become a critical superego? And thirdly, what will posterity make of my work? Where will it rank me in the agone of authors? Longinus adds that the products of a mind afraid to write for posterity are bound to be abortive, and that's his metaphor. It's clear, however, that this anxiety inheres in the whole psychology of creative imitation, so that what we have here is a proto-Bloomian mentality. And not accidentally, I would say. The young Harold Bloom was once told by William Wimsatt, the new critic, "The trouble with you, Bloom, is that you're a Longinian, not an Aristotelian." Colin Burrow gives Bloom rather short shrift in this book, perhaps justifiably. My own point is that beneath Bloom's Freudianism, there is an ancient layer, partly submerged, of indebtedness. And this prompts the larger reflection, which is as good a place as any to end these mere marginalia to Colin's superb book, that critics themselves can be, and perhaps cannot but be, imitating authors. Thank you.
Thank you. On page 307 of this extraordinary book, Colin cites Pope in his Peribathos, saying, "When we sit down to write, let us bring some great author to our mind and ask ourselves this question: how would, in this instance, ironically, Sir Richard Blackmore have said this?" And this is something that Stephen has just gestured to. So I did wonder in sitting down to write this talk whether I should hazard Burrowian emulation. I asked myself, WWCBD, what would Colin Burrow do? And I tried to list for myself characteristics that would mark Burrowian performance. Stunning phrase-making would be among them, erudition, as Stephen has already mentioned, range of reference, and an ability to move deftly between deep but lightly worn classical and humanist learning and YouTube and Battlestar Galactica. That's something I cannot toggle deftly between, evidently, with an eye to aptness and topicality. But something I also know about Colin from having heard him lecture and heard his recent LRB talk on fiction and lying is that you also have to have in your repertoire an excellent Bristolian or Brummie accent to pull out in the imitation, in the reading of other people's quotations, and that, along with these other characteristics, I certainly do not have. So I abandoned my plan. But not only for that reason, because to do so would run against the spirit of one of the threads that runs through this book very clearly, which is precisely to avoid the recipe-like addition of elements as the model of imitation, something that Pope parodies in Peribathos in his receipt to make an epic poem, as if there were a set of ingredients that one could draw together in order to produce an imitation or produce an authentic rendition of a particular genre. Rather, as Quintilian and as many of the theorists that Colin mentions in the book, and indeed in the passage that he was just reading, imitation paradoxically persists in a deep, long-acquired, well-digested, well-metabolized acquaintance with the authors one wants to imitate that becomes a hexis or a habitus or a disposition, which enables you to produce as if you were Colin Burrow or Cicero. There's a further paradox arising from the book's fundamental question, which appears on the very first page and which is repeated in those 4 points that Colin read himself recently. That question, in Colin's words, is how do human beings learn sophisticated usage of language from others and yet end up sounding like themselves? And there's something very interesting and it galvanizes the whole book, interesting to me about this particular paradox. And the book, both in spite and because it is about imitation, is also a history of originality and implicitly also of genius and its slippery sibling Ingenium. I want to quote a couple of lines from Robert Burton, which touches on precisely this paradox and draw out from them some of the ways it intersects with themes in Colin's book that I think raise questions. Burton says, in his Democritus Junior to the Reader in The Anatomy of Melancholy, stilus virum arguit, our style bewrays us, and a man's genius is described by his works. I find this interesting for a variety of reasons, and I will draw them out as the questions that I want to raise for Colin as we proceed. The first of these is that in Burton's pun on the stilus, something that occurs frequently in Colin's book, the stilus as the pen and the stilus as the style, or as the bodkin, as the sharp satirical implement. Stilus virum arguit, our style bewrays us. There's something about our style, that intrinsic, idiosyncratic, inimitable thing of ourselves, that is something we produce automatically or despite ourselves, that betrays us in various senses, that gives us away. That's a kind of parergon to our intentions, or produced only by an incidental effect of our running stylus or pen. So while ingenium on the one hand operates at several points in this book as that idiosyncratic, particular quiddity, as I think Colin uses the word quiddity once, the particularity of an author, ingenium is also something which is not within our control, something that is not a part of our willed and plotted machinations. Machinations is an appropriate word here because ingenium or ingenia are also engines, precisely the kind of automata that Colin devotes a chapter to towards the end of the book. So how does this nexus of deliberation and accident work? The second point that I want to draw out from this is that Burton in this passage translates what, as far as we know, is his own Latin tag into English. Producing a polyglot pun, but also a shift from the singular to the plural. Now, Colin is very down on one of Sir John Davis's puns on fama in one of his chapters, where Davis uses the Latin senses of fama, both fame or rumour and fames, hunger, in an English poem to make a joke. But it seems to me that the practices of double translation in the period which takes up the bulk of the English section of this book, the kind of early modern and 17th century sections, practices where people are educated by translating Latin into English and then English into Latin, mean that writing in English is, in a sense, writing in and out of Latin, always an echo, at least until the late 18th century, and his own 9th chapter. It's a feature of parrots, which, along with bees, are two of the presiding geniuses of the animal kingdom in this book, that they practice a kind of pretty polyglottism, as in John Skelton's Speak Parrot. And my favourite footnote in this book, and there is a list of favourite footnotes, my favourite footnote is footnote number 2 in chapter 1, annotating Pretty Polly, an epigraph to the chapter, with parrots passim. And I wonder if we could think about the ways in which this is also a story about the English language and English literature finding its own genius in relation to its classical predecessors. So John Florio, in the introduction to his translation of Montaigne, talks about the genius and inseparable form of individual languages, which mean in metaphors which are also everywhere in this book, in this study of imitation, that a translation can only ever be a picture of a body, a shadow of a substance, says Florio. But if languages have geniuses, how far is the effort to imitate the Latin patrimony or the Greek patrimony an effort to learn sophisticated use of language on behalf of the language itself, and yet end up sounding like English literature? Because in lots of ways, and canon is a word that Stephen already brought up, this is also a book about the emergence of an English canon, of an English list of who it is appropriate to imitate and how to imitate them. Finally, I just want to raise the question of recognition in a couple of senses. Burton's phrase suggests that our own idiosyncrasies and our own style is something that is unknown even to ourselves. And something that really strikes me about the opening question that I quoted earlier is that the phrase appears there, that we find that it's the way that I've now managed to lose my, here it is. How do we end up sounding like, how do authors end up sounding like themselves? And on the one hand, this is a colloquialism which we use all the time, but it also seems slightly ontologically weird. What is it to write like oneself? At the beginning of Henry V, it said of warlike Harry, like himself, that he will assume the port of Mars. What does it mean to say that somebody is like themselves? Colin quotes the example of Pope writing imitations in the manner of Pope. So one can evidently imitate one's own manner. One can also evidently fail to imitate one's own manner. Stephen cited the example of Petrarch. A less elevated example is the supposed fact that both Charlie Chaplin and Dolly Parton apparently came second in lookalike contests for their own persons. So one can fail to be sufficiently like oneself in order to be recognised. Now, this is obviously a relatively frivolous example, but it's a different version of Eve and Narcissus gazing at their own reflection. What one encounters as other, as an it, is belatedly recognised as a self in that moment. And the moment in which Milton takes Eve's encounter with herself in the pool, her opening kind of self-recognition as an imitation of Ovid and as a subsequently imitated portion of English literature is key to lots of the chapters in this book. What is it to recognise that one is indeed like oneself? Emerson, in reading Montaigne in a slightly different mode, said, "It seemed to me as if I had myself written the book." What is it to recognise not that the book is an imitation of something else, but to recognise that you yourself are, in some sense, the author who has written something which somebody else claims as their own? And this last example suggests another sense of recognition, and this is my final point. This is a book about writers imitating and about writers reading in order to imitate what they are reading. But I'm interested also in the question of how we recognise imitation, how we aptly or inaptly count something as being imitated. I think of this partly because of a book that I read many years ago called Imitating Thomas Browne, which started out as a series of examples of people who claimed to be imitating Thomas Browne, and then the second half checked whether they were really imitating Thomas Browne by putting the text through a computer and seeing if they did indeed match his stylistic exploits. And I think that example, I mean, certainly the computer can pick up unconcealable idiosyncrasies which are nonetheless not consciously produced by the writer or consciously registered by the reader. And it might seem that it can then tell us something that we do not know about ourselves or cannot detect about ourselves. But really, I think we want to place the recognition of imitation and the reception of imitation as something that is interpersonal, that happens between us as habituated and idiosyncratic readers, connections that we are able to make, analogous to the recognition of faces or to the recognition of other people. That facial recognition metaphor also runs all the way through this book. Reading in Greek is anagnosis, can you confirm, or recognition. So there's a sense in which there's a kind of recognising principle at work in reading anyway. This book is, on the part of Colin himself, a dazzling display of readerly recognitions, and many of the pleasures are wonderful readings in which imitations and concealed imitations and half imitations are picked out. And I wonder if we could think a bit about the ingeniousness both of the writer but also of the ingenious reading of imitation that Colin himself exemplifies. Thank you.
Thank you. We didn't plan it this way, but your concluding with recognitions enables me to say that I'm here really just as a ghost or a replicant. Terence Cave was going to be another respondent to this, but he can't come because he's stuck in Paris for various reasons. So I'm here as a sort of version of Terence. From the outset, it seems to me that one of the exciting things about this book is the number of defining, structuring observations and sometimes claims that concern not only recognition, and imitation, the recognition of imitation, but the movement and the kind of movability of imitation across borders, as Stephen's already said, across languages and times. This capacity which imitation has to shift shape, gear, and even scale is an affordance, as Terence would say, generated by what Colin calls on several occasions the conceptual obscurity of this notion. The history of imitation as theory and practice, then, is one that, I'm quoting here page 6 and 7, that combines conceptual obscurity with metaphorical vividness, end quote. From the weakness of the concept, you might say, is drawn forth the strength of its metaphors. One of the real and significant contributions of this book, I think, both for scholars and for undergraduate readers and others more broadly, is its tracking of a whole host of metaphors, some animal, some vegetable, and some even mineral, all the way through the history of imitation. One, to go back to the sort of what would Colin do, I was suspicious towards the end when I first read the final section of this book to encounter an author whose name seemed to me to be too much like an author that Colin might have made up. The Canadian poet whose name is Christian Book. Now, this particular Canadian poet on page 422 is said to have, quote, this Canadian poet, Christian Book, had a project called the Xenotext. Book began with a radical aim to embed a poem within the genetic code of the extremely durable bacterium, Deinococcus radiodurans, which, as its name suggests, could even survive a nuclear holocaust. In some way, I was disappointed to discover on the internet and elsewhere that Christian Book does indeed exist, and this wasn't one of Colin's metaphorical fictions. Because these metaphorical elaborations throughout this book actually figure forth the history of imitation as it works its way from the Greeks to the geeks, from Aristotle all the way through to AI. Bees, bodies, buildings, and brass. Unfreedom, agency, and originality. Hexis and Hector's ghost. And then finally, scalar poetics, Milton's sin, and sad cyborgs. All these and more are to be found in the rich treasure trove of metaphors, examples that run through this book, as it moves from mimesis to imitation, between rhetoric and poetics, transformation, dreamitation, through to the operative categories of the middle half of the book, which are then developed in the second half, adaptive and formal imitation. As a French early modernist, or an early modernist working mainly in the French tradition, and therefore consciously eccentric to this book in ways that Colin elaborates on the opening page, actually, where he says his participation in the Montaigne reading group here in Oxford convinced him that he wasn't going to talk about French stuff. It's a great shame, but there we are. I want to explore the strength and the salience of the notion of subjunctive imitation in particular, as a way of thinking of imitation as a kind of generative grammatical principle. Because imitation in the subjunctive enables us to see the author as, quote, an adaptive principle, which might speak or write in a different way in response to changing circumstance. That's on page 176. In relation to early modern readers, then, imitatio might on the one hand be, quote, a script for the self-determination of an aspirant aristocratic class in a sort of self-fashioning mode that's now become very strongly explored in early modern studies. But it might also be thought of through its very key words and terms as a means to, quote, express, and Colin does a good deal of work on the term express, to express the deep mutual involvement between a new sense of authorship in the early modern period and the practices of print culture. Or again, and this is an example not in Colin's book for reasons that I've just explained, but I think is sort of virtually present, it might, through Montaigne, be a way in which an author can think of themselves as being in some place and time altogether different from their own, but somehow still themselves. There are two ways in which that operates in Montaigne that I want to draw attention to very quickly. One is in the essay 140 on some considerations on Cicero, where Montaigne uses the image of the seedbed to not in order to put some kind of xenotype thing going on, but in order to say, to anticipate that in some sense, to say that anybody who reads his essays, if they read carefully enough, might find themselves, in a sense, inspired. He doesn't use the word inspired, he says pushed through peeling the text, éplucher, peeling the text to generate for themselves, quote, infini essai, infinite essays. Now, for us Montaigne nerds, the fact that Montaigne has there mentioned the word essay with a big E means that he's also referring to his own book as printed object. In other words, that his, if you like, self-expression as a writer might generate further copies of himself by readers, which themselves would be called essays. It's one of those moments where imitation has a particular charge at a particular moment in the history of authorship as of print. Another one is when Montaigne writes in the margin, and many of you will know this, and it takes us back to the late Antique, or to the Latin writing. Montaigne writes in the flyleaf of his copy of Lucretius the following, which I'm going to translate. Seeing that the movement of atoms is so diverse, it would not be unbelievable if the atoms once came together or come together in the future so that a mother Montaigne might be born. Now this is a recasting of a fantasy in Lucretius himself, reimagined by Montaigne to imagine a Montaigne in the future that nonetheless knows itself to be Montaigne. We're back to Katie's question about how can you, in a sense, imitate yourself, and what's it like to be like Montaigne. Petrarch, persona and print. Montaigne, movement, metaphor, and monsters. I've written a lot about monsters, and there are some great monsters in this book. There's a lot more to ponder about all of these things in relation to the French tradition. But I want to conclude with one final example, one which concerns precisely the matter of imitation as example. In other words, something that sort of shadows this book, but never quite takes on full form. And that's the question of imitation, both as poetological practice and as an ethical question, whereby it becomes a kind of model or pattern for behaviour, as in the passage which, in fact, Colin read out right at the beginning. In thinking about this, I want to return then one last time to Terence Cave's work and to his translation of this. Published anonymously in 1678, but set in 1559, The Princesse de Clèves is, amongst other things, an imitation of the Heptameron, written by Marguerite, Queen of Navarre, first published in 1559. The back page in the Oxford World Classics translation says it's a turning point in the history of the novel and a landmark in the history of women's writing. And that's all true. It's also a searing, powerful and passionate account of the question of imitation posed as an ethical dilemma. Its author, Madame de Lafayette, practices imitatio and in fact transposes imitatio into the ethical question of exemplarity. And she does so all the way through to the last sentences of the novel. I'm not going to do a spoiler alert, except to tell you that it ends with the princess leaving the court. Leaving the court, marriageability, intrigue and gallantry behind, the princess, quote, adopted a way of life which dispelled any thought that she would ever return. And then here's the final sentence in the last two sentences in Terence's translation. She spent part of the year in the convent. The rest she spent at home, though in profound retreat and in occupations more saintly than those of the most austere houses of religion. And the final sentence, her life, which was quite short, left inimitable examples of virtue. It's that notion of an exemple inimitable that this book turns around. And I'm not going to say that Colin is an inimitable example, but I will say that one of the questions this book raises is precisely this relation between its declared subject, authors imitating other authors, and the wider question, which in fact, as I say, he alluded to in the passage that he read out, which is people imitating other people, the degree to which authors are a special kind of imitation, or whether in fact we all do this most of the time. The word now goes back to Colin.
Well, thank you all very much. I recognise and acknowledge the faults, but not necessarily the nice things that you've said. But it's very kind of you all, and there are lots of things to address. I mean, particularly helpful to hear from Stephen about the ways in which imitation is treated differently within the study of poetics and rhetoric in the classical world. And I suppose I'd respond to that by saying that in early modernity, the poetic and the rhetorical were thought about together, and that's why I've tended to retroject, as it were, a concern with the imitation of texts into some of what Plato says about the imitation of the world. And so my vision in that respect, I'm sure, is occluded or shaped by the fact that I'm principally an early modernist. And I would see those two things as necessarily becoming meshed. Whereas, of course, as you say quite rightly, early on they're rather separate. I don't talk a lot about intertextuality. I don't do I avoid that largely because I share Julia Kristeva's own discomfort with the way in which that term came to be used just to describe any kind of verbal echo, when what she originally means by it is a transposition of the generic characteristics of one form into another in order to create a new form. And I think that that's a sufficiently strong idea to deserve preserving. But I also don't go there because really I want to talk about texts as being potentially things that you could regard as people, or as patterns of behaviour that could be regarded as people. And so I'm more interested really in the interpersonal than in the intertextual, and that's partly because I did a lot of reading which mostly gets buried in the book itself, but I did it in experimental psychology and discussions about the ways in which people learn from other people, and the distinction that experimental psychologists make between, which is a rather crude distinction, I think, between imitation, by which they mean gestural replication, and what they call emulation, which is the extrapolation of a task from a particular set of behaviour, and you then emulate it by doing the same task in a slightly different way. And a behavioural psychologist would say that what I'm mostly talking about is emulation rather than imitation. But you know, I began, as it were, thinking really about how people learn, and that's why intertextuality is not there quite very much. I don't talk about Bloom very much, although I do at one point say, rather snarkily, that if he knew anything about intellectual history, he'd understand where the notion of Bloomian rivalry comes from. It comes from copyright debates in the 18th century, really. The reason I'm so snarky about him and push him to the side is because in 1968 and 9, my family lived in his house. I was 5. And he was our landlord, and we trashed the place because we were... And he was not very nice about it. So, you know, there's a long-standing grudge.
That explains everything.
Yes. It's all there. But, you know, it was a long time ago, but I have a long memory. And I did review his last book, and he died between my finishing the review and it being published, so I had to make some frantic revisions where I wasn't quite as rude about him, and I also put it all in the past tense. So, yeah, you're quite right. But that was a really... eye-opening discussion of what I didn't know about, and that's terrific to hear. And the idea that critics themselves can be imitating authors, identifying tropes, figures, and shapes in earlier texts, I think is absolutely right. Although critics like Harold Bloom perhaps get a bit carried away by that idea. So I wouldn't, but that was very, very helpful. And Katie, again, so much to think about. I mean, that point you raise about how we become conscious of ourselves as distinctive stylistic agents, I think is a really crucial one. And in the course of the book, there are lots of different metaphors for imitation, but the two that I particularly zoom in on is a sort of closely coupled set of antitheses between the imitation as a live recreation of a living, breathing, independent body, as against an imitation as a ghost or double or shadowy semblance. And it does seem to me a significant fact that theorists and practitioners of imitation throughout its history haven't really been able to drive a wedge between those two things. That the point where you become a distinctive stylistic agent might also be the point at which you become a parody of yourself, and where you sort of lose that thinness and energy that sort of bodily energy that you thought you had, and that's why, although I'm not talking about intertextuality and probably not being very French, there is at the core of the book not a simple conception of a person as an agent articulating their own stylistic register, which can then be replicated by others, but there is a much more duplicitous representation of writerly agency as simultaneously something that you know about and which you feel to be an independent being, but which is also potentially a sort of shadowy replica of what's gone before. And it seems to me that what you say about the emergence of English literature and the canon of English literature from Latinity is relatable to that, because one of the biggest chapters in the book is about Milton, who is often accused of being too Latin to be fully English. And his particular kind of style, which is defiantly his own and yet also deeply Latinate, it seems to me exactly points to the area that you're drawing attention to, of sort of polyglottism that turns into a distinctive idiolect which can claim its own autonomous space. So that was really for me, a very sort of helpful angle to take on the whole book, and I felt that I had been there was a sort of, I'd be flattering myself if I said I'd been well understood. It seems to me that you brought out something which I hadn't really brought out myself, so thank you very much. And the point, and I suppose much of what I've said already leads into what Wes was saying about exemplarity and the notion of the person or the behaviour as an object of imitation and inspiration of subsequent practice, because the inimitable example is in some ways another version of the paradox of the thing which is simultaneously itself and also another thing. And that, I suppose, is what I think human beings and authors are. And I think the process of literary, the literary traditions generally unfold through a sort of peristaltic relationship between exemplarity and inimitability. So those were my responses, but thank you very much. They were really very stimulating indeed, your comments, and I feel I've done them scant justice.
Thank you.